The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida History and Culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org. The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida. What does it mean when someone is called a Florida cracker? Many people believe the term refers to pioneer cowmen cracking their whips. Others think that the name Florida cracker comes from the practice of cracking corn to create dietary staples of early settlers. It's also possible that William Shakespeare created the word cracker in his play King John from the 1590s. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotemarkle. Whatever its origin, the term Florida cracker is used both positively and negatively. In its broadest sense, Florida cracker is the name for pioneer settlers and their descendants. These pioneers were mostly of Scotch-Irish heritage and first arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries.
We know that the word itself is very old. It's 16th century Old English. Cracker had an extra E in there, but it was a term that the British Crown and the Spanish Crown used to describe these rogue white settlers in Florida and the Southeast. And we actually have historical documents that describe these people as crakers. The word goes way back, though. Even Will Shakespeare used it, and if I can remember it, I think it was King John, the play, where he said, "What craker is this that deafs our ears with this abundance of superfluous breath?" which is a nice way, of course, of saying somebody was full of hot air.
The term cracker, when students, teachers, parents hear it, more than half, you can see their eyes light up and their eyebrows will raise, because unfortunately it has become a derogatory term in the past. But that's part of the education here, is that we explain the process of how the cracker term came about. And the pride. Florida crackers are very proud that they are Florida crackers, and it is a way of life, a heritage that has gone through many years and developed over time.
The earliest documented usage of the word cracker refers to a braggart, a boaster, and a lover of tall tales of Scotch-Irish descent. The term evolved to include unauthorized white settlers who came to Florida before it was named a United States territory in 1821.
By the time the Spanish and the British were settling Florida, it became known as a word to describe these rogue white settlers who paid no attention to the authority of the crown. They would tell them where to live, and they wouldn't live there, and they would tell them they couldn't live in a place, and they would. And we have letters going back and forth to the Spanish and the British crown describing that.
The independent spirit of the crackers came from their Scotch-Irish roots. Escaping war, poverty, and religious oppression in the 1700s, they emigrated to the Carolinas and Georgia, with some making their way down into Florida. The life of a Florida cracker was challenging.
Daily life, just like in this house, 1880, everything the family did, and it was the mom, the dad, and the children, from the minute they woke up until the minute they went to bed, they worked. They worked here on the farm. And anything they ate or wore or used, they produced themselves. The only way that they would raise money was through sugarcane grinding and selling sugarcane syrup. So if they needed something that they could not make, like bricks or something, they would store up the syrup, take it to town, and that was a big day to go to town, and either trade or sell their syrup.
Well, it was hard. I don't think they ever considered themselves impoverished, though. They just considered themselves pioneer stock that essentially had to live off of the land. And every once in a while they would go into the town and get some store-bought food, which is usually coffee or sugar or something like that. But it was a difficult existence, and many of the crackers were subsistence farmers. They raised hogs. Later, they were cattle farmers, cattle ranchers.
One of the jobs of the children was to sweep the yard, because the grass was could help the fire. If there was a forest fire, there needed to be a fire break. So the children kept the yard, the area inside the fence, completely free of grass and shrubbery. So it was a very difficult way of life.
If you live in Florida with no air conditioning, no running water other than a pitcher pump, you can imagine that times were tough, and the people had to be tough or they wouldn't make it. I'm not quite that old, but when I was a youngster, I had neighbors that had no electricity, and we had no air conditioning. And now I look back on it and I don't know how we did it, because if I had to go without air conditioning now, it would be very difficult.
They had the ability to settle and subsist in very, very challenging areas throughout the Southeast. And we know that the interior highlands were farmed. There were cracker fisher folk on the coast, and down in the Keys, we call them the conchs. That was what a Key West cracker is. They figured out how to subsist very much like the Native Americans did. The Native Americans developed settlement patterns based on the resources that were available to them, generally food. And that includes the estuary resources, shellfish and fish. There were a lot of crackers that survived that way. But in the interior areas, they grew their own food. They made their own products. They built their own houses. They made their own clothes. So they were self-reliant, self-sufficient.
And I'm really sympathetic to the whole point of view about how the Seminoles had their land taken away. On the other hand, an attack by the Seminoles was terrifying. They did scalp people. They used sort of guerrilla war tactics. So we know that happened, and that I think it's one of the reasons. I mean, if you were a pioneer here, you had to be a pretty tough customer. I mean, you had to be able to deal with dangerous circumstances. It wasn't Little House on the Prairie, I mean, it was especially in the 1830s and 40s and 50s.
Early cracker architecture was inspired by the design of Seminole chickees. These Native American structures had raised floors and open sides for ventilation and thatched roofs for protection from sun and rain.
The architecture, everything was built for use. The buildings were raised up off the ground. Everything was constructed for airflow. This building, the main part of the house is separate from the kitchen, and in between the two there is a breezeway. And the way the house is situated, and there's always a breeze going through the breezeway. And the breezeway is where the family did all of their daily living. They washed clothes, prepared food for dinners, they cleaned their saddles, and everything they did was right there on the breezeway. And also there's ventilation in the roofing system. Also the bedrooms, the walls of the bedrooms don't go all the way to the ceiling. Again, everything is for airflow.
There were always open and paired windows for cross ventilation. The roofs were steeply pitched to get the ventilation going that way, so the hot air was way up above them. The houses were elevated on piers, so you had any cool breeze blowing under the house that would keep the floor and the occupants above that. And they would even cool the middle of the house by building breezeways, or what the Crackers called dog trots, for a reason, because that's how the dogs came through the house when they weren't supposed to. But a breezeway was a part of the house that essentially separated a very hot kitchen from the rest of the house where folks were living.
Storytelling is an important part of Cracker culture for both entertainment and preserving family history. Cracker cowman Bone Mizell became the legendary subject of many stories. Bone's alleged activities include riding his horse into a bar to order drinks from his saddle, branding cattle by notching their ears with his teeth, and placing a friend's dead body on a northbound train since he never had the opportunity to travel.
Part of their oral tradition was storytelling. It's how their histories, their family histories, were passed down. It's how Crackers in the 1970s could tell stories about Civil War life, because it was passed down from generation to generation. Not that they couldn't write, many of them couldn't, but the histories weren't chronicled. So those oral traditions, passing those stories down, was a very important part of socializing at the end of the day, on the weekends, and then when all of the neighbors got together, or the Crackers in a particular region, and they would come in and have a sugar grind or a big feast of Cracker barbecue, and that's how you caught up on all of the politics and the gossip.
The Thomas side of the family came into Florida in 1820, and he married a girl who was born in St. Augustine in 1805, and her parents was well established there. They'd been there about 20 years, so I'm thinking, that had to be late 1780s or early 1790s. But I don't know what her maiden name was. If I could find that, I could find out more, about it. But they raised children, and there's Thomases scattered all over the place. But how many generations, I don't know. Longevity seems to run in my family. My daddy was born in 1882. Now, he grew up in a whole different era and environment. Now, you think about that, and I was born in 43, and he was 61, I think, when I was born. And my mother was almost 50. Well, his daddy, I think, died at a fairly early age. I think a one-eyed mule kicked him in the head, and that's what killed him. But then my great-granddaddy, who was singing about in that song about the Flatwoods of home, fought in the Great War of Northern Aggression, and fought in the Seminole Indian Wars, was at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and some of that stuff. And then they go on back before him, but the number of generations, I just don't know. So I ain't gonna say I'm a 7th or 8th generation Cracker. I don't know if I am or not. I just know they've been here a long time.
Cracker storytelling is incorporated into their musical traditions. It's not surprising that Florida folk music sounds much like Appalachian and Celtic music, since they share a common ancestry.
They didn't have expensive banjos, but they had homemade guitars. and even homemade violins, and we have a lot of fun with the wash tub bass, but that was a real musical instrument, and percussion was anything that they could get around them. And some of the best music in the South has emerged from those traditional roots.
Since the mid-20th century, Frank Thomas has been one of Florida's most respected folk musicians, along with Gamble Rogers and Will McLean.
Will was a big inspiration for me. He encouraged me to write about Florida. He said, you write all these love songs, cheating songs, you don't do much of that. Write about what you know. And he used to tell me that it would take all of us doing all we can to tell Florida's story. There's so much history in the state of Florida. You say Florida and they think about Dismal World, and the Tragic Kingdom, and the beaches. They don't understand that more calves are birthed in Florida than anywhere else. The calves are birthed here, they ship the calves out west to the feed because it's cheaper to ship the calf one time than to ship food in here to fatten them up once a month or whatever. So it's just, it's fascinating stuff, and this area where we're at right now up here in North Florida, this was a big tobacco growing country. Cotton was big up here. And I guess, back before the war, they had plantations up here, probably had slaves working on the plantations. Florida, it's just fascinating to me, the history of it. All the way back through the Spanish and the British, and then the crackers came in, and here we are today.
Florida's cracker cowmen, also called cow hunters, made the cattle industry the driving force of Florida's economy well into the 20th century. The state was the biggest supplier of beef to the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Florida's cattle industry can be traced all the way back to Spanish exploration in the 1500s.
Well, it was on Ponce de Leon's second trip to the New World that he brought horses, actually, and cows. People are not sure of how well that went on that second trip because some of the historical information has the cattle scattering as the Calusa, I believe Indians were the ones that met him on that trip. So perhaps the leftovers of those cattle, many of them that ran wild and ended up with the Indians, was the beginning of what we have here now and as the Florida cracker horses. There are also stories that support DeSoto bringing cattle. But getting here, however they did, they're here now, the descendants of them. And we refer to them as cracker cattle. They're actually Spanish from Andalusia.
Cracker cattle, if we can call them that, what became the Andalusian cattle, were introduced by the Spanish. And Florida had a thriving cattle industry long before Texas and the Great West. But the cracker culture sort of shifted in the early 1800s. It was mainly due to the Arms Occupation Act in the early 1800s, which provided any settler with a certain amount of land. So it became prosperous. It became attractive to folks to start raising cattle and getting free land to do that.
There were very few fences, hardly any at that time. So cows were on your property and you were rounding up your own cattle. If you got a few of the neighbors in that bunch and you weren't honest, you changed the brand.
With the open range, it's easy for to come along and change brands. It's easy for me to come along in the spring and just brand all the calves I find rather than just the ones that are following the cow with my brand on it. And so there was a lot of, cattle wars and range wars.
Thousands and thousands of these cattle escaped over fenceless ranges, and it was very popular for cracker cow hunters at one time to overbrand and collect road cattle. And Frederick Remington, when he wrote his article in the late 19th century, was utterly disappointed and wrote this fantastic, wonderful disparaging piece in Harper's New Monthly magazine. And he was so incensed by what he saw. It wasn't the romanticized Western cowboy culture that he had just experienced. It was something radically different. But because he was so upset with the way that he was treated and what he saw, that he described it in meticulous detail. So it's one of the best ethnographic accounts that we have of the late 19th century cracker cow hunter and cowman culture.
In 1949, Florida became the last state to pass a mandatory fence law to keep individual cattle herds contained, effectively ending the practice of rebranding. While cracker cowmen no longer have to round up their cattle on the open range, the name cow hunter is still used.
There were no fences. So the cowboys that would go out into the scrub to collect the cattle were actually called cow hunters, because they would go to hunt their cattle if they needed to come collect them for branding or to take them to market. And we do have heritage cracker cattle here. And there's associations that are extremely diligent about making sure that breed is pure. They will not add an animal to their registry unless it is documented and certified that it's a true cracker animal.
Some of the history books refer to what we call cracker cattle as like donkeys, in that they're very small, they're bony. Some of the information all says they're not very good for either beef or milk, but they're very hardy. They've got good immune systems, external parasites, internal parasites, and that's true of the horses too, the Florida cracker horses, which are of that Spanish bloodline.
Cracker culture still exists in Florida, but urban sprawl continues to threaten this rural way of life.
The long arm of civilization is reaching into these areas like southern Ocala, which is now the Villages, used to be cracker country all the way down to Brooksville. I grew up there. I remember seeing that every time I took a trip that way. But they're disappearing.
To teach the Florida cracker heritage is so important because it's a way of life. It's very important to the many generations that have grown up in this area. There are some families here that have been here for 5 generations, and this is their family's history. This is a story that needs to be told. And that is one thing that the Florida Agriculture Museum, it's our mission to tell the story of Florida agriculture's past, present, and future. And the cracker is the past, it is the present. There are still many people still living the cracker lifestyle, and we need to continue that in the future too.
These days, if you're a cracker, you wear that as a matter of pride and with great honor. It's not the term that it used to be. It happened somewhere around the time Jimmy Carter became president, and the Southern culture started to emerge, and people were fascinated with it. But these days, crackers are at least the ones that aren't terribly private. Crackers are quick to tell you about their heritage, because it is that. It isn't just a description of a people, it's a description of their culture, and that's really what they embrace.
The population of Florida has been expanding exponentially since the mid-20th century. Cow pastures, farmland, and citrus groves are replaced with housing developments, shopping centers, and highways. Florida's cracker culture is being preserved, though, at places like the Pioneer Settlement for the Creative Arts in West Volusia County, Fort Christmas Historical Park in East Orange County, and here at the Florida Agricultural Museum in Palm Coast. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime on the web at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brookmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida history and culture from the Ice Age to the Space Age is on display at the Brevard Museum of History and Natural Science, located at 2201 Michigan Avenue in Cocoa. The museum has nature trails through 20 acres of 3 Florida ecosystems. The People of Windover exhibition features information about Florida's prehistoric past and actual artifacts used between 7,000 and 8,000 years ago. More information at brevardmuseum.org. The Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, the Florida Council of Arts and Culture, and the state of Florida.